Sorry, I'm on video 2 already. Boy, this is a complex topic. Okay, sorry, I got cut off mid-sentence there. What I was saying is the Contras were doing some nasty stuff, but like how much they were doing is depends who you listen to, the right-wing media or the left-wing media. This is one of those things where there's two versions of reality. So yeah, there's the Contras going in, which Reagan's funding. Now, what was happening with the Sandinistas? Sandinistas, when they came, this is kind of the classic story of revolution, right? Everybody hates Somoza. So as long as we're fighting against Somoza in the 1970s, everyone's against him. But then, what happens when Somoza leaves? How do you make a government? And yeah, like that's the point where cracks begin to appear. The Sandinistas had a lot of support from the Catholics, but they also had a lot of support from Marxists. And there was this tension there, right? Because on some points, you can say, okay, well, Christianity is all about helping the poor, and Marxism is all about helping the poor. But that's kind of a very oversimplified kind of view of it. Kind of in the nitty-gritty, there's all these disagreements here. There were, I think, six Catholic priests who were part of the Sandinista government. But the Pope was very ambivalent about these priests kind of being part of the Sandinista government. Initially, there was a report that the Pope said, priests can't be part of the government because the priests have to focus on their church duties. Said, if we need Catholics in the government, we can just get some lay Christians to fill these roles, and the priests have to kind of look after priestly stuff. It turned out that was actually just a rumor, even though that had been reported in the papers. But the Pope did say, you cannot do any official church stuff with your priestly rule. The Thomas Borges, I guess I'm on the topic of the issue between Christianity and the Sandinistas. This may be kind of a minor thing, but this was something that was very in focus in the American media, especially kind of the American Christian media, which is one I looked at. So we've got that conflict. The other thing is Thomas Borges, who was the co-founder of the Sandinistas, one of the only surviving co-founder of the Sandinistas by this time. Very pro-Christian, and he laid it on pretty thick. He said, let me say Jesus Christ today, Jesus Christ tomorrow, Jesus Christ forever. He was using the name Jesus a lot. He's got an interesting story, and it's one of these stories which is really terrible and really wonderful at the same time. So Thomas Borges, he's this Christian Sandinista rebel. When he had been captured during the guerrilla war, he had been captured by Somoza's forces, and Somoza's National Guard. This is a terrible story, but it's got a redeeming ending. Somoza's National Guard castrated him, and in front of him they killed his wife, they gang raped his daughter, and then they killed his daughter. And then he eventually got kind of freed from prison, I think, in some prisoner exchange deal. And then he was back with the revolution. And when the Sandinistas finally took power, they captured like Somoza's National Guard. And Thomas Borges kind of went down to the prison to find the men who had done this to him, had killed his wife and daughter and had castrated him. And he opened up the prison door and he said, "I forgive you, you're free." Wow. Yeah, that's an amazing story. And I've often, when you read history, history is so terrible some of the times, isn't it? And I hate to say this because I've got leftist sympathies myself, but the history of leftist revolutions can just be brutal. The French Revolution, the Soviet Revolution, I just think, if only more leftists acted like that, if only after like the Soviet Revolution, they've been like, "I forgive you, you're free." I think the left has some of this doesn't apply to the left today. Some of this is kind of the history of Marxist revolutions, which is more historical. But I guess historically speaking, the left has shot itself in the foot by giving itself a reputation for just being brutal during these kind of terror phases of the revolution. That Thomas Borges things, if when he forgave the people, the soldiers who had persecuted him and just set them free. There are a few other stories like that. Thomas Paine, part of the French Revolution, voted against the execution of the King Louis the XVI. Thomas Paine said, as he was voting against it, he said, when I go back to America to write the history of the French Revolution, he said, I would rather write of 1,000 errors of mercy than kind of one error of revenge. So he said, just let him go. You don't need to punish him. So that Thomas Paine example and then the Thomas Borges example, it's just a pity we don't have more of that in history. But, that just kind of shows the kind of person he was. Very committed to both kind of the Marxism, but also to the Christianity aspect of it. But the Archbishop in Nicaragua, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. There's one more element. There was a tension because the Sandinistas had such a Christian influence. They tried to create kind of a people's government church. It was kind of like a church kind of connected to the Sandinista movement. And that did not go over well with Catholics, who viewed this as kind of an attempt by the government to take control of the church. And maybe it was. I don't know. Who knows? I mean, the sympathetic reading is it was an attempt to integrate Christianity with their socialist program. But the non-sympathetic reading is maybe it was an attempt to take over the church. Despite all these kind of ties between the Sandinistas and Christians, the Archbishop in Nicaragua did not like the Sandinistas. I forget his name, and he was an outspoken critic of it throughout, and there was kind of conflict between him and the Sandinistas. Some of these Catholic priests ended up having to kind of resign their positions with the Sandinista government kind of as the years went on, and the friction between the Sandinistas and the Catholic Church got greater. Now, so this was a big deal in the 1980s, because Nicaragua was a political thing in the U.S. Exactly how much of a deal this was, I mean, Chomsky had a point. I think he was in a debate once, and they were talking about, how mean the Sandinistas were to the Archbishop. And he said, well, look at what's happening in the U.S.-supported dictatorships in El Salvador. He said they don't say mean things about the Archbishop in the press. They kill the Archbishop. Romero got assassinated by U.S.-supported dictators. And here we're making a big deal about the fact that the Sandinistas just say mean things about the Archbishop in the newspapers. And I'm kind of sympathetic to that line of thinking myself. Some of this maybe gets a little bit exaggerated, but there was tension between the Sandinistas and the Catholic Church. The other thing is, I'm going to mispronounce this, but I think it's Mosquito Indians. No, it's not Mosquito. Mosquito Indians. There's some sort of indigenous group on the border between Honduras and, Nicaragua and, I forget, El Salvador or Honduras. Kind of indigenous natives there. And there were a number of misunderstandings between them and the Sandinistas. They did not view themselves as Nicaraguans. They viewed themselves as kind of indigenous kind of tribes or jungle people, to use the kind of unsophisticated term for it. Sandinistas, there were a couple of issues. The Sandinistas tried to impose environmental regulations on the area because they were cutting down trees. And this ended up creating tension. The other issue is because this was kind of on the border, there was an issue with kind of arms kind of being funneled through, going to the Contras. Because of these misunderstandings and the Sandinista attempt to kind of control these areas, there was a few massacres of these people by Sandinista troops. Now, the Sandinista government apparently never ordered these things. These were just kind of, like what happened in the Vietnam War or something. Troops out in the field kind of getting out of control and exceeding their orders. But it did look very bad on the Sandinistas, and this was kind of one of the big black eyes internationally. Okay, so getting back into the history of it, there was constant debate about how democratic the situation in Nicaragua was. The leftists said, it's a completely, open democracy. They're social democrats. The rightists said it's a dictatorship, blah, 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 blah. There was an international election in 1984, and because Nicaragua was under such scrutiny, they got tons of international observers down in there to make sure the election was fair. And everybody said it was fair. Everybody who was watching the election said it was fair, except Reagan. Reagan and the U.S. government refused to acknowledge it. They said, no, it was a totally unfair election. The other big thing, aside from the Iran-Contra, is the CIA put mines in Nicaragua's harbor, which was an illegal act of war. Nicaragua went to the to the International World Court. And the International World Court found in favor of Nicaragua, saying, yeah, the CIA, you can't do this. I forget what it was. They had to pay money or say they were sorry. I forget what the punishment was. Some sort of slap on the wrist. But the World Court supported Nicaragua. Now, this was one of those things, if you're into media analysis in the 1980s, no major newspaper in the U.S. reported this. None of the television stations, there are only kind of 3 television stations in the U.S., none of them reported this. All of them focused instead. The World Court, I think the same week, had told the Soviets they had to get out of Afghanistan. So that was the big news, and none of it even mentioned that the World Court had kind of condemned the U.S. for mining Nicaragua's harbor. So that's kind of like often cited by kind of people like Chomsky and kind of leftist media people as like a huge bias in the U.S. news. The situation in Nicaragua continued to deteriorate throughout the 1980s. There was a civil war going on. And the Sandinistas spent a lot of money fighting the civil war, which was money that they couldn't put into their social programs. So that kind of also put stress on the government and lost some support. And then they lost the election in 1990, which was kind of the end of it. Although actually, Daniel Ortega, who was like the main Sandinista guy, came back in 2006. I didn't know that at the time because I wrote my paper in 1999. That's looking ahead. That was viewed as the end of it at the time. Now, again, this 1990 election, depending if you view the left-wing version or the right-wing version of it, it proves something. Nobody agrees what it proves. I listened to Reagan's autobiography on audiobook a few years ago. I don't know, just because a friend had it and I just listened to it. And Reagan in his autobiography said, I know a lot of people were critical of what we did in Nicaragua, but just look at what happened in 1990. That proves we were right all along. And that's kind of like the logic. They lost the 1990 election, the Nicaraguan people were sick of the Sandinistas, Reagan was right all along. If you talk to somebody on the left, though, they say, this proves that the Sandinistas were Democrats the whole time. Democrats with a small d, democratic. They lost a democratic election, and they stepped down from power with no bloodshed or no coup or something like that. So that proves that Reagan was wrong about them the whole time. So both sides are taking different lessons from the fact that the Sandinistas lost the election in 1990. Reagan thinks it proves that he was right the whole time. People who supported the Sandinistas think it proves that the Sandinistas were really just social democrats the whole time and were not dictators. Okay, so that's kind of the history of it, which gets confusing. Now, the Protestant, my media analysis, I looked at Christian Century and Christianity Today. Now, I guess, kind of Protestant politics during the 1980s. This was kind of the period where the religious right was beginning to be a thing. It hadn't really been a thing before Reagan. But people forget this nowadays because, like, nowadays I think evangelical churches are so closely associated with the right wing and with the Republicans and stuff like that. People forget that Protestant churches had been like one of the main sources of opposition to the Vietnam War, kind of during the 60s and 70s. And that kind of tradition was not entirely dead by the 1980s. So there was a lot of kind of Protestant church opposition to Reagan, and Protestants kind of supporting, well, either they were outright supporting the Sandinistas, which some of them were, or they weren't supporting the Sandinistas, but they were very upset about Reagan's interference in Nicaragua, and especially kind of the Contras and these atrocities that the Contras had been doing. And this is interesting now because nowadays people completely forget about Nicaragua during the 1980s. But this was a big thing at the time, and a lot of people thought this could be the next Vietnam War. And so there was actually, this came up in my research for Christian Century. Protestant churches kind of released a plan. They said if the U.S. ever invades Nicaragua, which people thought it might. People thought, this could be the next Vietnam. The U.S. might invade Nicaragua. They said, this is our plan. And I forget, because I read this 20 years ago. I made a passing reference to it in the thesis, but didn't detail it. But there was this plan that they had detailed that, they were going to seize government buildings, or they were going to shut down intersections in major cities. There was like this plan that these Protestant churches were developing to kind of shut down major cities if the U.S. ever invades Nicaragua. So that was what kind of made this interesting. Now, in the thesis, I do kind of the boring work of going through year by year and talking about what got reported when. Like in 1981, there were 3 articles in Christian Century and 2 articles in Christianity Today. The article in Christian Century showed this. The article in Christianity Today showed this. I'm not going to go through it. That's the most boring part of the thesis, is kind of slogging through. I say that actually is the whole thesis. That's the whole thesis, is kind of slogging through it. But the thesis itself is kind of less interesting than the more general issue behind it. I'll just talk in kind of broad terms, I guess, about what I found, is that initially both magazines were very supportive of the Sandinistas, even Christianity Today, the conservative one. As time went on, Christianity Today got more skeptical about the Sandinistas until kind of near the end they were pretty much anti-Sandinista. Christian Century moderated its tone. So by like the end of the 80s, they had still had some writers who were supporting the Sandinistas, but they also had some writers who were saying, look, these Sandinistas, it's time for them to go. They're doing more harm than good now by hanging on to power. But they were kind of universally against the Contras. And this is... Right, so this is where we get into polemical history. Something which is in debate is exactly how nasty the Contras really were. But Christian Century took the opinion that these Contras were very nasty, and they've got some horrifying stuff in here. This is, I'm just going to read this because, wow. This is from 1986. Christian Century is doing, it's an article in Christian Century telling about what the Contras have done to these villages. So a local village, the Contras came in 11-year-old Helena, whose hands are horribly mutilated because the Contras used them for target practice. Her older sister, who was gang raped on the floor of their tiny house, Carmen Alviera, whose 3 teenage sons were kidnapped while cultivating their little plot of land and have not been heard of since. Just awful stuff. And yeah, and the continuing criticism is kind of every little thing the Sandinistas did wrong. You know, like they said nasty things about the Archbishop, got blown up in the U.S. newspapers. But these terrible atrocities that the Contras were doing, you know, it gets reported in Christian Century, but it did not get big coverage in major newspapers in the U.S. The Christian, there was also, sorry, I'm jumping all over the place, but another piece of this thing, the religious right was beginning to coalesce around this time, kind of Reagan's base. And there was a guy named Pat Robinson. He's still around today. He was a big player on the religious right. He had this TV show. And he would pray for the Contras on his TV show. You know, pray that God would help the Contras fulfill God's mission. And he also collected money on his religious TV show to kind of give to the Contras. You know, the Reagan administration was forbidden from doing that, but there was no law forbidding Pat Robinson from collecting money. Christian Century, the liberal Protestant magazine, was very critical of this. They said, one of their writers said, he is tithing for terrorism. You know, he's collecting Christian tithes from Christian people and giving this to a terrorist organization, which is what they said that the Contras were. Also, Christian Century, kind of, the CIA was very active in supporting the Contras, even after they shouldn't have been. Like, even after kind of Congress said, no more supporting the Contras. And Christian Century reported, because the issue of religion was kind of playing up so much both within Nicaragua and back in the US, the CIA had like this training booklet where they told the Contras to open up all their meetings with a prayer and to close all their meetings with a prayer so that they would kind of appear more religiously acceptable to kind of mainstream people in Nicaragua and the US. And Christian Century had uncovered this CIA training booklet for the Contras, and they talked about that in one of their articles. Sorry, I'm letting my biases sneak through this a little bit. I'm on the left, so I'm kind of following the leftist biases of this. I'm tending to accept this stuff that Christian Century has dug up about the CIA and the Contras and stuff like that at face value. Somebody on the other side of the political spectrum would be a lot more skeptical of this, or would have different interpretations. Actually, it's interesting. Quick digression here. When I was presenting this, because we had to present this to the rest of our class at the end of the term, we had to kind of stand up and make a speech, and I did a presentation about our paper. I did the same thing I'm doing now, where I completely ignored the meat of the thesis and just kind of talked about the broader issues surrounding it. But there was another guy in that same class who had also done his thesis on Nicaragua. He had done his on Paul Henry, who was he was the Republican representative for Grand Rapids, Michigan, which was the town we were living in. And he had been very supportive of the Contras kind of all throughout the 1980s, kind of always voting funds for them. And he did his report on kind of Paul Henry's political views of what was happening in Nicaragua. And he was more kind of Republican leaning than I was. So he had a very kind of sympathetic view of what the Reagan administration was doing. And I had a different view. And we tried to be diplomatic to each other when we were kind of presenting our opposing views on the thing. I mean, it is... Sorry, I'm going to go on another digression here. It is one of those things I think we have, right now, in this space in history, in the 1980s, when this was happening, there were two different versions of reality, and that was confusing. But this was, I think, relatively rare at the time. There were events like the Vietnam War and the Nicaraguan Contras where there was disagreement about what was happening. But people broadly agreed on reality. We have reached a point in the civil discourse now, in 2018, where no one agrees on reality anymore. Everyone gets separate views of reality from the internet. And this was a precursor of the age we are now living in. I'm out of time, and I'm just going to finish here. There's more to say, but I've said enough. I'm going to cut myself off.